Thanks so much for joining us, especially from so many different parts of the world. I think the gender pay gap is a particularly interesting thing to think about from an international perspective. One of the things you'll see in my presentation is that different countries are taking different approach to try and address it. So it'll be kind of fun to talk about that. So there's three things that I'd like to do in this webinar. One is I'd like to talk a little bit about gender pay gap definitions and causes. We see lots of different definitions and it's a very complex issue. So it'd be really great to see if we could get onto the same page. Then I want to talk about some top-down strategies. And what I mean by that are the big policy initiatives that countries are taking that affect entire nations and workforces. And then I want to end up talking about what I call outside-in strategies. And these are the things that we can do as academics, as practitioners on the ground to try and nudge organizations in the right directions. So we'll start with that whole idea of definitions and causes. So the definition that I've given you here is the formula that is used by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And the formula that they use looks at the difference between men and women's median earnings divided by men's median earnings multiplied by 100 to bring it to a percentage. So for example, if men are making $1,000 a week and women are making $800 a week, we would describe that as a 20% pay gap. And whenever we talk about pay gaps, positive numbers signify that men are making more money than women. Now, I chose those numbers with intent to get us to 20%. Because that's what the OECD describes as the overall gender pay gap around the world. So without taking into account specific country differences. Now you're going to see in this presentation that there are a few places where I just pause and try and take a step back and think about some of the implications. And this is the first example of that. You know, it looks like a really straightforward formula, but one of the things that we see in gender pay gap research is that sometimes it's really hard to compare apples with apples because there are little tweaks that different groups make to the formula. So the OECD is very specific that they focus on median earnings. They're looking at the middle wage in an entire distribution. You'll find other groups that focus on mean earnings. There are some groups that include the CEO in these calculations. There are some groups that exclude the CEO. And one of the really big things that we see making a difference is that some groups will calculate the gender pay gap specifically on salary. And some groups will think about the gender pay gap as focusing on the entire remuneration package. That would include incentives, bonuses, things like that. So always make sure that you're trying to compare apples to apples. Today, I'm focusing on this definition because the OECD is one of the few places where we can find the same calculation being used across different countries. So when we look at those international comparisons, usually Scandinavian countries report the lowest gender pay gaps. And that's largely because of some of the particular policies and practices that they have. So they offer extended parental leave for both parents. There's wide embrace of flexible working arrangements. There's highly subsidized childcare. And those things tend to narrow the gender pay gap. Australia, the United States, the UK, Canada, we're kind of around the middle. We tend to have about a 14 to 17% pay gap. And at the other end, we have South Korea, Israel, and Japan with pay gaps around 20 to 30%. So I just want you to appreciate, wow, you know, these are really wide ranges. We have incredible diversity in gender pay gaps in different parts of the world. We also have quite a range of gender pay gaps in different occupational sectors. So in general, the public sector, education, manufacturing, these tend to report somewhat smaller gender pay gaps. And a lot of it has to do with how standardized processes are. So in the public sector, there tend to be very standardized wage structures, so not a lot of deviation. A lot of times the public sector is setting wages in agreement with unions, so they're very well defined. Manufacturing, it's very easy to define performance based on objective output. People might even be paid on piece rate. So these sectors tend to have smaller gender pay gaps. Where we see big gender pay gaps is in areas like healthcare, finance, and professional services. And there's a couple of things that really distinguish those occupations. One is that in areas like professional services, the definition of performance can be really subjective. So now we're not measuring how many widgets you manufactured, but it might be about client satisfaction or the size of the projects. So there's a certain kind of subjectivity that gets built into those kinds of evaluations. The other thing that's really important about all three of those sectors is that they tend to be areas that employ lots of women, but at the top, we tend to see men dominating the leadership roles. So in the academic literature, we often talk about male-dominated hierarchies, and we also use the term glass escalators to describe these occupations where there's plenty of women, but they're not necessarily in leadership roles. Now, when we talk about the causes of the gender pay gap, there are many, and I'm just going to focus on 4 of the ones that I think of as the really big ones. So it's really interesting that when we look at MBA programs, and we look at men and women graduating from the exact same MBA program in the exact same year and going out onto the job market in the same economy, we see these very small but very consistent gender pay gaps. So women are making just a little bit less than the men from getting out of their same MBA program. But what happens over time is we give people pay raises based on their past salary. So we often say, oh, you're a great performer, I'll give you a 12% pay raise. But if both the man and the woman are getting a 12% pay raise on a small differential, the gap is widening. And in fact, gaps like this widen over people's careers. So by the time men and women retire, women have saved only half the amount for retirement that men have. So little differences at the start really add up over time. As a general rule, anytime that you're making pay decisions based on pay that someone made before in a previous job or what they made last year, you're probably creating a gender pay gap. The second cause of gender pay gaps is the fact that women still are the primary person who is responsible for childcare, for any kind of family responsibilities for elderly parents. And what that means is that they are taking career breaks from their career ladder. And during that segment of time, when they're primarily focusing on their family and not on their career, they're missing some critical performance reviews. They're missing some opportunities for pay raises. So again, we're widening a gap. Third factor is related to leadership gaps. Naturally, the jobs at the top of the organizational hierarchy pay more than jobs at the bottom of the hierarchy. And we tend to find fewer women at the top than we find at the bottom. There's a really interesting pattern that we see in how men and women get promoted. We make a distinction between getting promoted based on performance and getting promoted based on potential. Women are more likely to be high performers in the role that they had. They take on increasingly more responsibility until they're actually doing the job above them, and that's when they get promoted. Men are more likely to get promoted because someone sees potential that they could grow into a higher level job. But what that means is that they tend to get promoted a little bit faster than women do. So they reach the higher paid jobs a little more quickly. And then finally, there's occupational segregation. The places where we see a lot of women working is in early education, in healthcare, and in childcare. And these are occupational sectors where historically we haven't paid very well. So they tend to be low paid jobs to begin with. So here's my second opportunity to pause. So here are these causes of the gender pay gap. And what I point out is that these causes make it really difficult to motivate organizations to correct gender pay gaps. It's really hard to generate a sense of stakeholder outrage, to get organizations to do something to fix this problem. There's a really strong negative public sentiment when we can show that men and women in exactly the same job are getting paid differently. We recognize that as pay discrimination, and we don't want anything to do with it. But these causes are more complicated, right? Because it's so easy for stakeholders to say, but women choose to have a family. Women want to focus on their family. Women are choosing these occupations. We wouldn't want to force women into occupations that weren't their first choice. And that's absolutely true. We wouldn't want the gender pay gap to be fixed by constraining people's choices. But what I think we don't really appreciate is that these are choices that are good for society as well as individual women. And as a society, we haven't done a very good job of supporting those choices. So there's a much bigger picture here outside of individual choice. Okay. So that was definitions and causes. Now let's think about these top-down strategies. What are we seeing societies doing to try and correct gender pay gaps? And what I think is interesting is how differently countries are trying to address this. And if you read the abstract for this seminar, I already gave you the spoiler, which is that all of the strategies are problematic. Pretty much everything we try to do on a policy front has unintended consequences, things that we didn't see coming that create new problems when we were trying to solve the original one. And first, I'm going to talk about a policy strategy that is becoming quite popular in the United States. So Colorado, California, New York City, Washington states, all of these individual states and cities have adopted legislation that requires employers to put in their job ads a pay range. And the idea here is that if applicants see a pay range, if they know what the top and the bottom look like, they'll have more bargaining power. They'll be in a better position to say, wait a minute, you offered me this low salary. Why am I not at the middle? Why am I not at the top? So that was kind of the philosophy. And right now, this legislation covers about 1/5 of the labor force in the United States. And I was reading the other day that quite a few employers who are not even covered by this legislation are starting to do the same thing. So we're starting to see many more reports of pay ranges in job advertising. But we're also seeing organizations trying to game the system by giving these massive pay ranges. So pay ranges that span tens of thousands of dollars, which makes it impossible for applicants to really get any kind of leverage because the range is just so big. And just to give you one example, there was an organization that put up a job ad where the pay range was described as going from $0 to $2 million. Okay, a crazy example. And the organization got a lot of heat on social media and said, oh no, it was just a mistake. We forgot to fill in that part of the template. And fair enough, it probably was a mistake. But the reason I bring it up is it's just one extreme example of a trend that people were seeing, and applicants were getting really frustrated that the pay ranges didn't feel real. So what we're probably going to see is some tweaking to this legislation, where some people are suggesting that we need to constrain the pay range to maybe the high end can only be double what the low end was. So watch that space. We're going to see some changes in that legislation, I think. But it's an interesting question to say, well, what's going to happen in the long run? We can take a look at Denmark, and I know somebody is in the webinar from Denmark today. So in 2006, there was a law in Denmark where companies were required to calculate their gender gap statistics, and they weren't publicly available, so they weren't available to just anybody, but some parties could request those statistics, like unions, for example. So companies had to do the calculations. They had to have the data ready in case it was asked for. And so after 15 years of doing this, we can kind of look at Denmark and say, well, when we put that kind of pressure on firms, what happens? And what we see is that there is pay compression. What that means is that firms are shrinking their pay ranges so that they're much, much narrower. Is that good or bad? From an HR perspective, we'd be concerned that it might be demotivating, right? It weakens the performance pay link if somebody who's a high performer doesn't have the opportunity to make much more money than someone who's a poor performer. But the really interesting thing is this bit. What we found in Denmark was that the gender pay gap narrowed over time, but not because the firms were paying women more. It was because they were paying men less. So the way they narrowed the range was to reduce the amount of high-end male applicants into the system. So it is one way of increasing gender equity within pay, but it wasn't the original intent for the whole pay system to be pushed down rather than up. So here's a different example, and this is one that comes from the United Kingdom. So in the UK, they passed a law in 2017 that required firms to disclose their gender pay gap once a year in April. And the idea was that this was going to create public accountability, that if a firm published a gender pay gap that was big, female applicants would just stay away, right? They wouldn't apply. They wouldn't be interested in that firm. And if organizations wanted to attract talent, they really needed to clean up their act. So the whole focus here was that this was a way to get firms to be motivated to improve their reputations. So does it work? I want to tell you about some really interesting research, this research by Sharkey, where what they did was they looked at the relationship between firms' disclosure of gender pay gaps and Glassdoor ratings. So if you're familiar with Glassdoor, it's a place where applicants and employees can evaluate employers. They can list pros and cons of their experience with the organizations. They can make recommendations whether they think that their friends and family should apply to these jobs. So it's a neat way to measure reputation. And what these researchers found was that firms that reported a small pay gap in April enjoyed improvement in Glassdoor evaluations. Now that's good news, but it is the only piece of good news that I'm going to give you on this slide. Because what was interesting is the benefit was very short-lived. It only lasted 1 month. So you report a small pay gap in April, and by May, you've already lost the benefit to your reputation. Nobody's excited about it anymore. And what is particularly disturbing about it is that firms that had large pay gaps, even gaps over 20%, and from my early slides, 20% is a pretty sizable gender pay gap, there was absolutely no reputational effect. So there wasn't this public outcry that was visible in the Glassdoor evaluations. So not clear that public accountability is really going to do the job. This little icon is a tool that comes from the Gender Pay Gap Bot. And it's one of my favorite little things, so I wanted to tell you about it. This little bot was developed by people in the UK who are really frustrated with gender pay gaps. And what the bot does is every time an employer puts a post on Twitter about International Women's Day, which we just celebrated last week, they say, here, our women are so great. Here's a photo of the women who work with us. Here's a photo of us enjoying our morning tea at International Women's Day. This bot will retweet that posting with information about the firm's gender pay gap that they've pulled from this publicly available data. So it's meant to be kind of highlighting gender washing, right? Yeah, you're celebrating women, but you've got a 20% pay gap. The gap has been operating for the bot has been operating for a few years now, and it gets a little bit more sophisticated every year. So one of the things they did this past year was not only report the annual pay gap, but they also reported the change in the pay gap. And the developers of the bot have said that, their goal is not just public shaming. They also really want to celebrate improvement. So you might have a big gap, but if you're making things better, if over the last couple of years we can see that the gap is narrowing, they want to make that public too. So I really encourage you, if you're on Twitter, to follow the Gender Pay Gap bot. And now I'd like to tell you about some policy strategies in the country I live and work in here in Australia, where the focus has been primarily not directly on gender pay gaps, but on leadership appointments. So in 2009, the ASX required that large publicly listed firms in Australia had to report on the gender composition of their boards and their executive teams. And then in 2015, the Australian Institute of Company Directors set a target of 30% women on boards by the end of 2018. Now, we didn't make that target, but what we did see was big spurts of activity getting women appointed to the boards of ASX-listed organizations. And this had a couple of really interesting effects. One effect that we see in our data is that gender diversity on boards reduces gender pay gaps. Like, that happens really quickly. Whenever we have women on boards, they pay attention to gender pay gaps. They ask for the data. They're more likely to monitor the data. They're more likely to seek solutions to narrow gender pay gaps. So women just pay attention to different things. The other thing that happens is that when you have gender diversity on boards, you very quickly get gender diversity among executives at one level down. And we call this the trickle-down effect. When we get enough women into very senior leadership roles where they're very visible to the market and also to other women in the organization, what happens is women look at those very, very senior women, and they go, oh, well, this is a place where women actually succeed in these senior roles. Maybe I could succeed here as well. And so the organization has the benefit of getting many more applications from women, and they're able to be quite picky and choosy in appointing women to senior leadership roles. And it just becomes easier for them to fill in senior leadership ranks. So the trickle-down effect is a really powerful accelerator. You get enough women on boards, you're going to suddenly see a whole bunch more women in executive team, executive feeder roles. It's all really good. But you already know by now that I never show you a policy strategy without telling you that there is a catch, and there is a catch here as well. So we looked at 3,478 executives who were working in ASX 500 firms, so the 500 largest firms in Australia. And these executives were in part of this big boom, right? The stakeholder pressure to make more female appointments. We're getting women into these senior roles. So is there a gender pay gap? Yes, there is. And it's pretty big. There's a 20% pay gap. Again, a pause, a reflection, a couple of observations here. A 20% pay gap is pretty big. Remember, I started out by saying that the gender pay gap in Australia is only about 15%. So you can really see this widening effect. The other thing that I think is really interesting is remember who these women are. I mean, they are being appointed into these roles in a situation where firms are under a tremendous amount of pressure to make female appointments. They're hungry for female senior talent. These are women with years of experience. If there was anybody you thought could negotiate themselves into a good pay package, it's these women. If anything, you might think, well, maybe organizations are paying them a pay premium in order to, get the stakeholders off their back. And in fact, we see a 20% pay gap. So I think it just goes to show that you can't really fix a gender pay gap just by negotiating harder. Like, it's just never going to happen. And the final point that I want to make while we're on this slide is just to notice the 20% pay gap on base salary and the 20% gap on incentives. And you're always going to see more gap the more we look at discretionary parts of salary packages. So the more your pay is determined by bonuses, the more it's based on overtime work, those kinds of things are going to widen the gender pay gap. So one more piece of research from Australia. Now, I was just talking about comparing male and female executives in general. What happens when we have a gender pay gap among male and female executives within a particular organization? So in this research, we looked at over 500 top management teams in ASX listed firms. Now, this first line I'm going to show you, this blue line, this comes from organizations that did not have a gender pay gap within their top management team. Their male executives are paid the same as female executives. And what that blue line is showing you is that as those firms put more women in the top management team, as they're hiring more women executives, their financial performance is going up. This is great, right? This is what every diversity researcher wants to see on her PowerPoint slide, because we're always sort of saying that the more diversity you have, the more creative and innovative your organization is going to be, the more you're able to reach diverse customers, and that's going to be good for your performance. So we see some evidence of that. Here's what happens in the firms that do have a gender pay gap within their executive team. In those firms, as organizations appoint more women into executive roles, their financial performance declines, and it declines significantly. It's a very serious decline. Now, this kind of makes sense, right? Imagine that you're appointing a group of senior executives who are going to steer your organization forward, but you create a two-tier system where you pay some of them less and some of them more. You're basically saying, you know, half of the members of this team, their ideas aren't as important. You don't have to pay as much attention to them. So you're actually making the executive team less effective. They're less able to leverage the diversity that's within the team. And that shows up in the organization's bottom line. I really wanted to show you this research today because it's this kind of work that I think gives us the potential to get some traction with organizations. Because what I think this research shows is that we shouldn't be thinking about gender pay gaps as being a problem for women. We should be thinking about the gender pay gap as a problem for women's employers. And that kind of gets us away a little bit from this language of, well, if women just made different choices or if women negotiated harder. No, this really tells you something about how the organizational structure is creating problems for the organization's future. Okay, so in that last bit, I was very much focused on these big policy decisions. And most of us are not policymakers. Most of us don't always have the direct ear of policymakers. But I really believe that there's something every one of us can do on the ground. And that's where I want to take us in the next part of the presentation to think about what kind of advice can we give both to organizations and to employees or job applicants? Given that the gender pay gap exists, what can we be doing to create some positive change? And I'm going to talk about organizations first. So whenever we're talking with organizations, with managers, whether they're line managers or HR managers, here's some advice that I think we can give. The first and most important one is to conduct a pay audit. We're never going to correct gender pay gaps if organizations are not even aware that they have a gender pay gap. And you would be surprised how many organizations are really in denial that they have a gender pay gap. So I'm going to give you a really specific example. There's an organization that we have worked with who thinks of themselves as very much a market leader. When they set wages, they're at the front end. They never want anybody to feel underpaid in their organization. And so they actually have kind of semi-formal policy that anybody walking in the door as a new hire is going to get a 15% pay raise above what they were making at their previous employer. They were adamant that they did not have a gender pay gap because they were a wage leader. Be surprised, you do a gender pay gap, and in fact, women are making about 15% less. And this makes sense, right? Because when you say, I'm going to give everyone a 15% raise over what they were making at that other organization, you're still perpetuating any sort of bias that was in the market. So, got to conduct a pay audit, got to see the data. I think it's especially important that organizations look at pay audits at different levels. And you've seen that in the data that I showed you today. At entry levels, the gap may be very small, but it will widen over time. And so you may need different solutions at different levels. Second piece of advice is put women on compensation committees. I gave you the evidence that when we see women on boards, we see gender pay gaps narrow. That's especially true when those directors are responsible for compensation directly, because then they have their hands on the data. Maintain pay through career breaks. Some of the most progressive organizations who are most committed to narrowing the gender pay gap, what they're doing is making sure that they stay in touch with parents, whether it's men or women, who are taking career breaks to make sure that they still have their performance reviews, that they don't lose out on any pay raises that the rest of their cohort is getting. We can encourage organizations to encourage both men and women to take parental leave. What happens as more men take parental leave is career gaps get normalized, right? It becomes less of an anomaly to have people be absent for a period. And that motivates the organization to pay attention to what's happening to compensation while people are away. A really important thing is to create a separate close the gap funding bucket. When organizations got motivated to address gender pay gap, one of the things they did was they went to their compensation budget, but that was money that had previously been allocated for pay raises or for promotions. And it's a really bad thing when you're correcting an inequity and therefore having to tell people that you can't motivate them by offering them a pay raise for very high performance. So smart organizations separate those two budgets. And finally, it's really important to sponsor women into leadership roles. The more women we have at the top, the more we are going to get women at every level, so that when we do the gender pay gap analysis at each level, we can do within level corrections, as opposed to seeing the huge gaps that result when women are all at the bottom and not at the top. And then we can think about what employees and applicants can do, right? We don't always think about employees and applicants as having a lot of power or clout in this system, but there are many of them. And if they engage in the same behaviors, they can be a very powerful force together. One really important thing is that when you enter an organization, you really need to educate yourself about pay ranges. Now, most people would ask family, friends, people in their network, what do you think is the right level of pay for this job? What can I expect? What is the pay range? The problem is that we often don't recognize how gendered our networks are. So women tend to rely very heavily on information that they get from other women who are usually underpaid relative to men in their organization. So they're getting very skewed information. So we need to get information about pay ranges from both men and women in our networks. I always encourage applicants, both men and women, to ask about gender pay gaps in interviews. And if your interviewer doesn't have the data, doesn't know where to look for the data, that's a really important red flag, because it means they're not really monitoring pay gaps within the organization. You can also examine annual reports for gender diversity. The amount of gender diversity in leadership roles is probably a good indicator of how much gender pay gaps there are across the organization. Be sure and keep monitoring as you advance and change jobs. You know, we are really used to monitoring our progress based on improvements of what did we make last year or what did we make in the previous job. And we don't always recognize when the market has moved ahead of us. So we always have to be doing the comparison at every change point. And because you're probably not going to be fortunate enough to work for a progressive organization that is proactive in keeping in touch with you during a career break, you're going to have to be extra proactive at keeping in touch with your manager and asking and requesting that your compensation be reviewed along the way, even though you're not part of the organization at that moment, because the last thing you want is to fall behind. You really never make it up. So I am a really big fan of small steps. I really believe that those of us who are not in policy roles, we can still make a really big difference through education by putting this information in people's hands so that we can influence one manager, one job applicant, one organization at a time. So I would really like all of you on this webinar to think about this final slide as a call to action, right? This is the things that you can start doing tomorrow to help narrow gender pay gaps. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing so that we can have a chat about it.